week 9. Thank you.
So today we are going to talk about East Africa, and also I'm going to talk about the Nilotic Sudan region. But let me first begin with East Africa, and because it sets up the video that we will be seeing, and to some extent it also sets up the reading for this week, which is Marcia Wright's book on strategies of slaves and women, which is more East Central Africa in the interior, but all of this is connected in some rather interesting ways, which we can actually discuss on Moodle for those who are going to be preparing questions either for this week or for next week. East Africa is important historically because of the Swahili people who inhabit the coast of East Africa. The Swahili, which is it's the African language that's spoken by more people in Africa than any other language, is an interesting language. And it, to some extent, the reason it's interesting relates to its very interesting intermediary role in African history and its connections with the Indian Ocean and with the Arabian Peninsula. Technically, Swahili is a Bantu language, like the other Bantu languages, and that predominate throughout all of the southern 1/3 of Africa. But it's a Bantu language that's been very heavily influenced by Arabic. It's been influenced by Arabic for two reasons. One, because Swahili are very closely associated with Islam, and of course Arabic is the language of Islam, but also because of a peculiar relationship between the East African coast and the Arabian Peninsula, and particularly with Oman. And as we'll see today, there was a period in the 19th century where the capital of Oman was not actually in Oman at all, but it was on Zanzibar Island off the coast of Tanzania. So let me go back in time, because the Swahili historically go back a very long time. The East African coast has a peculiar relationship with the Indian Ocean. It is, of course, the westernmost part of the Indian Ocean, and therefore was always part of the Indian Ocean commercial world, and the Indian Ocean, what some historians have called the Indian Ocean global world. And the reason for that is the nature of ocean travel, sea travel, in the Indian Ocean, which is related to the patterns of the monsoon season. The monsoons are the pattern of weather in which for 6 months of the year the winds blow in one direction, and for the other 6 months in the year they blow in the other direction. And so the Indian Ocean is very different from the Atlantic Ocean. It's not as rough, except of course if there's a violent monsoon storm, but it's not as rough, and therefore the boats don't have to be as big in order to navigate it. But what the boats do have to do is they have to go in one direction only for 6 months, and then they go in the other direction for the other 6 months. And that's in effect how trade was governed across the Indian Ocean, all the way from Southeast Asia to the Indian subcontinent, to the East African coast. So the Swahili were always part of this commercial pattern. And merchants came to the East African coast for very specific items historically, and particularly ivory, gold, and they brought all of the manufactures of India and Southeast Asia. So that this was the connection. So in many ways, the Swahili looked across the Indian Ocean much more than they did into the interior of Africa, at least not until the 19th century. And in the 19th century, things changed very dramatically. Now, for our purposes, the Portuguese arrived in the Indian Ocean in the early 16th century after they had figured out the navigation of the West African coast, and after they got around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, they suddenly found themselves in the Indian Ocean. Not only that, because they came in, for the period, relatively large ships, the large ships that they needed in order to navigate the Atlantic Ocean. When they got into the Indian Ocean, these large ships provided an unexpected military advantage so that they could go virtually anywhere they wanted in the Indian Ocean at any time of the year because of the way they could change their sails and therefore could sail with or against the monsoon winds. And as a result, the Portuguese very quickly dominated the Indian Ocean in the 16th century. And their large ships also meant that they could carry more goods than the much smaller vessels that were common in the Indian Ocean. So that the Portuguese established their own outposts in India, in South Africa, on the East African coast, in Southeast Asia, and they used that military advantage of large ships to make a lot of money and a lot of resources. They didn't really conquer any land the way they did in Brazil, but they did have outposts, ports that they inhabited. And on the East African coast, that meant that they were at such places as Mombasa, Kilwa, which is near what today is Dar es Salaam, and most especially in the island of Zanzibar. And so that in the 16th century, the Portuguese virtually dominated militarily the Swahili coast. And so that was a major change. But by 1698, however, the end of the 17th century, things changed again, and Portuguese influence has declined quite considerably because of the rise of Dutch, and then British, and then French activity in the Indian Ocean, who could actually compete with the Portuguese there. And in 1698, the island of Zanzibar was actually taken and occupied from the Arabian Peninsula by Oman, and thus began a period of history from virtually 1700 until 1900 in which Oman became a dominant power on the East African coast, sort of wedged between and in opposition and manipulating different European rivalries. And by the end of the 18th century, Sultan al-Busaid of Oman increasingly invested in Zanzibar and in the East African coast. They did that on the basis of particularly the trade in ivory. Ivory was wanted extensively in India to make various types of ivory items, from salt shakers to jewelry, bracelets, and so on, that were considered relatively for wealthy people. And this connection between Oman and the East African coast and Zanzibar developed quite extensively, as you will see in the video. But I just wanted to give you somewhat of an outline of the major events during this period. By 1820, the East African coast had become so important to Oman that the government was as often located in Zanzibar as it was in Oman on the Arabian Peninsula. And indeed, Sultan al-Busaid's son, Said, who came to power in about 1820, then became completely focused on Zanzibar and to a lesser extent other islands just off the coast, most especially Pemba. And Said began to develop plantations on Zanzibar, and the plantation crop that he was growing was cloves and coconuts. And both of these were destined to be sent to India, and very quickly the cloves of Zanzibar dominated the production of that spice, which of course is important, especially in Indian food, but to a lesser extent even European food. And second, Said was interested in developing more the ivory trade, and by this time, 1820, 1830, the ivory of West Africa had been virtually exhausted. Virtually all of the elephants in West Africa had been killed by then, and therefore the production of ivory shifted to East Africa as a major commodity that was sent not only to India but to Europe increasingly as well. Now, there were also elephants in India, but the problem was that the elephants in India had tusks that were very, very soft, and the ivory broke very easily. And the advantage of the East African ivory was it was much stronger and therefore could be used for all kinds of things, and were much more durable. And indeed, one of the important uses of ivory by the 19th century was in the making of pianos, because the piano keys, of course, use ivory on the keys. So this was a major development, so that the ivory which came from the mainland and the cloves and coconuts that were grown on plantations using slave labor on Zanzibar, Pemba, and to a lesser extent elsewhere along the coast. So that's in some ways an overview of why Zanzibar, which by 1840 was in fact the capital of Oman. The capital was moved from the Arabian Peninsula to Zanzibar because Zanzibar became more important than the homeland itself, Oman, and remained that way for the rest of the 19th century. In a sense, you can almost see that Omani domination of the Swahili Coast was similar to European domination of South Africa and Sierra Leone and other places, and hence set the stage for foreign occupation of large parts and then almost virtually all of the African continent, which we will talk about later. But in the case of East Africa in the 19th century, a major change happened, because before the 19th century, the Swahili coast was virtually isolated from the interior. Just behind the coast, in Tanzania in particular, it's relatively, it's not desert, but the rainfall is very, very low, so that there are nomadic people, the Maasai, who herded cattle, and farmers that were widely scattered. It wasn't a densely populated area. And hence, the trade along the Swahili coast was a trade that stayed right on the coast, at least until it got down as far as Mozambique. And it's only in Mozambique and in the Zambezi River Valley that you see extensive movement of trade and people back and forth into the interior. And that's what the Swahili coast connected with. And the Swahili coast also connected with the island of Madagascar, and there were Swahili colonies all on several places in Madagascar. Also dominated the Seychelles Islands, the Comoros, and other islands that are in the western part of the Indian Ocean. Hence, when Said moved the capital of Oman to Zanzibar, he was preoccupied with importing more and more enslaved Africans from the mainland. They came from particularly the region around Lake Malawi in the south, but in all parts. And then a new phenomenon happened, and this is associated particularly with an individual who's known as Tipu Tip, who was born in 1832 and died in 1905. His real name was Hamid ibn Muhammad ibn Juma ibn Rajab Murjabi, but his nickname was Tipu Tip. And he was a Swahili, Arab, slave trader from Zanzibar. He also was an ivory trader. He was an explorer. He owned and developed plantations, and he was a governor, and he worked for a succession of the sultans of Zanzibar. But Tipu Tip traveled into the interior of Tanzania, all the way to the Great Lakes in the interior, Lake Victoria, and Tipu Tip traded in slaves, and more than that, he organized militia that raided for slaves, that captured people, and between his enslavement of people and the large and very lucrative ivory trade, he in effect, he led many trading expeditions and military expeditions into Central Africa, and developed very profitable trading posts along those routes into the interior that went deep into the region, all the way into the easternmost parts of the Congo. And he bought the ivory from local suppliers and then resold it for a profit at coastal ports. Now, this has been described in great detail by a wonderful historian, Abdul Sharif from Tanzania, who you will see in the video. Abdul Sharif reported that when, after Tipu Tip went into the interior for about 12 years of what Sharif refers to as building an empire on the mainland, when he began doing this, he wasn't particularly wealthy. But by 1895, Tipu Tip owned some 7 very, very large plantations and had over 10,000 slaves on those plantations, all on Zanzibar. So that's the introduction to the video that relates to Zanzibar. Now, the other part that we're going to be looking at is really history of the Southern Sudan and the Sudan in the 19th century. That coincides with the same period of Said and Tipu Tip. Only here, the expansion was an expansion southward from Egypt, and it began under the reign of the Pasha of Egypt, and at this time, in Circe of about 1800, Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire, and the ruler of Egypt was in fact not even an Egyptian. His name was Muhammad Ali, the same name as the boxer of more recent times. And it was Muhammad Ali and his son and grandson who came to dominate Egypt. Muhammad Ali first appears in history as a general who worked for Napoleon when Napoleon invaded the Middle East, before Napoleon decided to invade all of Europe. Napoleon started his great campaigns in Egypt, not in France and not in Europe. And Muhammad Ali remained in power after Napoleon left, and it is he who really attempted to modernize Egypt, to some extent following some initiatives that stemmed from Europe and the changes that were going on in Europe. Muhammad Ali became very preoccupied with the production of cotton, for example, and cotton that was being exported to Europe. But Muhammad Ali and his successors decided that the way they were going to continue to modernize was to militarily conquer the upper stretches of the Nile Valley, well south of Egypt. And he therefore began on expansionist and imperialist movement up the Nile in the same way that Tipu Tip moved into the interior of what's now Tanzania. And so in both cases, like Tipu Tip, Muhammad Ali was someone who began the conquest of Africa before the European conquest actually superseded it and took over and went much further. So Muhammad Ali invaded the Upper Sudan in about 1820. Initially, it was the excuse is that the ousted aristocracy from Egypt had moved up the river, and they had established a new location in what's now known as Nubia in the northern part of the country of Sudan along the Nile River. But Muhammad Ali conquered and dispersed them and then kept going. And he set up a capital in what now is the major city of Khartoum, in the capital of Sudan today. And from there, his armies went out and deliberately tried to conquer and enslave as many young men as possible. And what he did with many of the young men is he took them north to Egypt and put them in the army. So in effect, he was using slavery to build an army. It was like a form of conscription, in a certain kind of way. Because of the long trip north to Egypt, and because of the disease environment, a lot of the people that were enslaved actually died. But nonetheless, Muhammad Ali did build up a big army, which he then tried to use to conquer all of the Middle East. He, to some extent, was successful. He got as far as Syria. He was eventually forced back into what today is basically Egypt, and including the area all as far as where Israel is now. And it was this period that dominated the upper reaches of the of the Nile Valley, and it's a period that's known locally as the Turkiya, after Turkish, because Muhammad Ali was considered to be really an agent of the Ottoman Empire. So after Muhammad Ali crushed the exiled rulers of Egypt, he moved on and established a base at Khartoum, and then set up generals who then really were in effect conscripting a population through enslavement. We see a period in which is referred to in history as a period of Egypt expansion and domination, which is what we're going to see in the movie. This lasted until 1884. In 1884, there was a major uprising under a messianic leader, a Muslim leader known as the Mahdi, and the Egyptians were all defeated and expelled. And then there was a period of approximately 20 years before the British took over this region, and we'll deal with that when we get to the period of European expansion. Hence, that's my introduction, and now we'll watch the videos that relate to these two major phenomena. One inland from East Africa, and the second one southward from Egypt.